Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this session. As I was signing in, I was listening to the interesting discussion going on, so I'm aware there's quite a lot of experts on board here also. I've followed the normal format of muting everyone, but please do feel free to unmute yourselves if you wish to ask anything or to use the chat function to do so. Before I start, I just want to thank Aaron Lovat. This is part of the Monday night series of shiurim, and I'm delighted that I have this opportunity to give this share in the context of that series. So thank you, Aaron, for arranging that. And also, before I start, maybe I'll just speak very briefly about the science of vaccination and immunology. I'll just speak about it briefly because we have a fantastic opportunity this Sunday to hear Professor David Katz and Professor Benny Chain, two exceptionally eminent experts on vaccination and immunology. And they will be speaking this Sunday evening, explaining to us a lot about exactly how the vaccines work, how our remarkable immune system works. We've all been hearing much more about the immune system over the last few months than perhaps we ever knew or perhaps even wanted to know before. And Sunday evening will be a really fantastic opportunity to hear from some experts about the science of this. But for now, in terms of the shiur and the halachas of vaccination, I'll just explain very briefly that the immune system, a very complicated system, a network of cells and tissues and organs that work together to fight off harmful bacteria and viruses. And the immune system eventually fights off infections by creating various means to fight them off, like large proteins, which we call antibodies, which effectively scout out and hunt down the infectious agent and mark it for destruction by the immune system. And it takes time for the immune system to recognize the harmful bacteria of the virus. And in the meantime, obviously, one can become very ill or, in extreme cases, die. So once our immune system has learned the infection, is able to, the specific antibodies remain, and the immune system is able to fight off the infection more quickly the next time. But in the meantime, till it's encountered infection for the first time, it takes it time to learn immunity. And the concept of vaccination is a simple way of gaining immunity. Basically, the vaccine contains perhaps a harmless form of the bacteria or the virus that causes the disease. And through that, the bacteria, first of all, it will be rendered harmless. The bacterial virus will be killed or broken down into parts so that it can trigger an immune response without making us sick. And the immune system will still attack the harmless form of the virus from the vaccine and produce antibodies to fight it off. And then it keeps the memory of the disease. So if the vaccinated person encounters the disease again sometime later, the immune system is ready to fight it off and prevent an infection from developing. Now, in the context of this shiur, I'm going to make a number of assumptions. The first assumption I will make is that I don't need to spell out to anyone here in this audience, anyone in our community, that vaccinations are obviously not part of a conspiracy theory. This isn't Bill Gates plotting to take over the world by injecting us all with a microchip. This isn't some deep government plot to control us or to cause us some terrible harm. I obviously don't even need to spell that out. Obviously, this is the result of reputable scientific and medical research, and there's no doubt about that. I also will take for granted that the Torah tells us in the Shematem Me'oid L'Nafshei a pasuk in Dvarim, which Chazal understand to mean an obligation to look after not just our spiritual life, but also our physical life. The Torah tells us many times, we are meant to live through the fulfillment of mitzvahs, and to do so because we humans have wonderful things to achieve, and therefore our lives are obviously important. And moreover, the Gemara learns out from a pasuk in Mishpatim that authority and license is granted to human beings to engage in medical research in order to understand better how to heal. We don't take a sort of pacifist approach that an illness is something given from on high and therefore it's not for us to fight. A doctor has permission to heal, and inherent in this Gemara is permission to heal, even though inevitably in every single medical procedure, there is some tiny risk involved. This is included in the permission granted to doctors to heal. So this is the premise of the shiur, that this is a reputable field of medication and therefore appropriate for us to engage in and indeed to use to protect ourselves and to heal ourselves. The figure who's most associated with the use of vaccinations is, of course, Dr. Edward Jenner. Even before him, actually, as a matter of historical interest, there was some understanding of the concept of inoculation. Inoculation was done, and there were others who were aware of it, including, indeed, induced immunity with cowpox. The background to the story is that Edward Jenner, who's most associated with this, he pioneered the concept of vaccination by noting the illness of smallpox, which was absolutely terrible, perhaps affected some 10% of people and killed them. And he noticed that those who worked with cows and got cowpox seemed to become immune to the more deadly variants of smallpox. So he understood these were related illnesses, and that somehow by getting immunity from the cowpox, the minor infection of the cowpox, the infection from the more serious infection of smallpox could be prevented. And he scraped some pus from the cowpox blisters on the hands of his milkmaid who had caught cowpox from a cow called Blossom. Incidentally, Blossom's hide now hangs on the wall of the St. George's Medical School Library, so you can go and visit her once lockdown is over, and you can see Blossom's hide. That Blossom was perhaps the mother of immunology, and through that created immunity in people through infecting them with cowpox. As I said, Jenner is often called the father of immunology, and possibly saved more lives than any other human being, even though the concept of immunization was somewhat understood beforehand and had perhaps been practiced for millennia. The way it used to be practiced was much more risky. They used to infect people with an actual dose of the illness, but a more mild variety. So they would wait and see someone who had a mild variety, or perhaps with a very small quantity of the illness, such that the viral load was less, and through that infect them. But Edward Jenner really pioneered the work of using inoculation from something which was harmless or close to harmless in order to build up people's immunity. There's a very interesting quote from the Tefaרת Israel, who was basically a contemporary of Jenner. They both lived from the middle 1700s to middle 1800s. Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, the Tefaret Israel, wrote a very classic work on the Mishnah, and we will come back later to him in the context of certain halakhic rulings. However, he talks about HaChosid Yena, which is how you would write in Hebrew, the pious man Jenner. And he says this is a wonderful person, a chosid, a pious individual who has a chelek in Olam Haba for his fantastic and life-saving work. So very early on in the process of the development of immunology, poskim and halachists were aware of these things and began discussing their halachic implication. So how are we meant to relate to this? Should we be taking vaccinations or not? Well, ostensibly, the answer is, of course, yes. I mean, the consensus of experts is that this is a safe medication. We are meant to behave rationally, and therefore, of course, we should take vaccines. How do we know in the halachic system that we should rely on the consensus of expertise? Well, this is reflected in many areas of halacha. A most common example is perhaps when it comes to Yom Kippur, when the halachic system deals extensively with the issue of who can and can't fast. And the Shulchan Aruch basically gives us two tools to assess medically the ability of someone to fast or not. And the first is to rely on the greatest expertise of doctors, and the second is to rely on the majority, the consensus opinion. And therefore, although in many areas, as non-experts, we may be a little befuddled, a little confused, we may be unable to determine ourselves, we don't have sufficient expertise to make a decision ourselves, we surely have enough expertise to work out who to rely on, and therefore we should rely on the consensus of expertise. which in Halacha mandates that indeed we should accept that. And since the overwhelming majority of scientific researchers and medical experts are clearly of the view that this is medically appropriate, Halacha would follow their determination. Now, unfortunately, however, it's not quite that simple, and we still need to think a little further. What about the risks involved? I mean, surely there are some risks involved. This is new medication. This is a new insight. It's perhaps been tested in a rushed rate and a rushed speed. How are we meant to deal with such risks? And the answer is that even if we assume, and actually we'll see that statistically this is not correct, but even if we assume that there is some low level of risk involved, which is has halachic significance on any level, we are still expected to weigh up and balance risk against risk. So if, for example, we look at the statistics over here, even when only the first level of testing was done, with perhaps several tens of thousands of tests, the rate of side effects and negative of side effects in the vaccination was very, very small, minimal. We're talking about rates well below 1 in 10,000, against significantly higher risks from the illness itself. And therefore, Halacha definitely expects us to weigh up risk against risk. Now, if you have some significant level of risk, perhaps it becomes a little more complicated. Can I take a significant level of risk actively in order to avoid a potential other risk that may eventually come? However, when one's dealing with low level of risks, this isn't halachically the correct approach, nor is it the reasonable and logical approach. But the correct approach to take is to look at overall and say you have a very low, extraordinarily low risk against a much higher risk, and therefore it makes sense to take this, even if we are concerned that perhaps there are some unknown side effects to the vaccination, which, as I'll say in a few moments, actually there's no reason whatsoever to assume. Now, the posek who first dealt with this issue actually has a London connection. There was a posek called Rabbi Hamburg. He was originally of German origin, but later lived in France. He came from the French town of Nancy. He was known as, excuse my French accent, but he was known as Rabbi Nancy, Rabbi from Nancy. And he had been rabbi in the city of Hague in the Netherlands, and later ended up in London, where he was associated with the Hamburg synagogue. He was a member of the Ashkenazi community. He was friendly with a very interesting character called Dr. Falk. He was also known as the Baal Shem of London, a very, very interesting man to look into if you wanted a little bit of historical research, Rabbi Hamburg. And in 1785, actually 11 years before Edward Jenner introduced the smallpox vaccine, he wrote a small halachic work called Ale Trufa, pages or leaves of healing, in which he addresses the wrongs and rights halachically of taking vaccination. And I would stress that this is talking about pre-Jenner inoculation, when the risks were really very significant, much greater risks than in modern vaccines. He had a particular sad and tragic association with this question, because he had lost 2 children to smallpox, as was common in the day. And he wrote extensively to many of the other poskim, to many of the senior poskim of the time, to discuss the issue of the vaccination. And the consensus in all their views was that absolutely one should engage in vaccination. And I again stress this was many centuries back, when vaccination really contains significant risks. Nonetheless, since the risks were minimal compared to the far greater risk of infection, it made sense to weigh up the pros and cons. This is the psak of Rabbi Nancy, Rabbi Hamburg, as I said, a London rabbi back in the 1780s. And this psak has been quoted by all the classic halachic works, whether the Kaf HaChaim in the Sephardi world, the Aruch HaShulchan, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, they all assume that this is absolutely the right thing to do. So certainly one's obligated to undergo this procedure, even if one would assume that it involves some low level of risk, in order to treat a disease that is liable to place us in far greater danger. However, the truth is that in many respects, it would appear that all of this is irrelevant, because all of this is assuming there is a low-level risk that has some factor in an engagement. But in fact, if it's a minimal risk to such a small degree that there's no measurable risk whatsoever, then all postsum would agree this has absolutely no weight in halacha. Now, of the tens of thousands of people who received the vaccine in the trials, there's absolutely no evidence of any danger caused by the vaccine. And according to all the medical experts, even though it's been approved in record time, it's one of the most effective and safe vaccines that's ever been produced. There's absolutely no reason, either theoretical or through the testing of it and through the rollout of it, for us to worry at all. In halacha, a risk of 1 in 10,000 is perhaps considered sufficiently negligible that one would ignore, and the risk over here is significantly less than that. So in halacha, there is no reason actually here to even consider the ruling of Rabbi Hamburg, who says one weighs up greater and lesser risk, because the lists here are tiny. They are well beyond any normal level of concern of risk. Moreover, even when one is dealing with measurable risk, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and many other poskim are of the view that risk is only determined by something which societally is taken seriously. And I'll give you an example of this. This is based on a Gemara in Yomah that talks about a risk that dosh bei rabim, that everyone steps upon, everyone ignores in normal function of day-to-day life. And it applies to this, the pasuk of Shomer Pesoyim Hashem, which looks after the innocent. No one can research and look into every statistic possible, and therefore it's reasonable to go with a societal norm of risk. So says the Gemara in Yomah, and Shlomo Zalman applies this to public health matters. And examples of this are everything in day-to-day life. Every time we cross the road, every time we take a plane, every time certainly we engage in bungee jumping or a sports activity, there's always a minimal level of risk. And nonetheless, society doesn't consider this a measurable level of risk such that it should affect our behavior. And therefore, again, this isn't a level of risk that halacha would be concerned about. So just to summarize what I've said so far in reverse order, first what I've said that the level of risk here, as far as we can tell so far, medically is negligible, beyond negligible. It's such a low percentage that it isn't a level of risk that's taken seriously by anyone in any other area of activity. And certainly in halacha, it's a level of risk where we don't need any other halachic principles. It's simply irrelevant to the level of risk, number one. Number two, even if it was a higher level of risk, it would certainly be below the level of risk that society worries about. And therefore we have the halachic concept of dosh bo rabim, a level of risk that generally one treads on, ignores, and it wouldn't apply. And finally, we see the ruling of Rabbi Hamburg dealing with far greater risky medical procedures in which he says one has to make a calculation of small risk against large risk. So this is the halachic background to taking a vaccine and the basis of the assumption that this is permissible and indeed obligated to do. In a few moments, I want to talk about numerous other halachic aspects of vaccination and to try and go through as many as I can in the time available, because there's really other fascinating things to talk about in the concepts of vaccination. But I felt responsible really just to start off with that, because just in case it needs to be said, that obviously all of us, as soon as we are offered the vaccine, should take advantage of it. Now, if someone says, okay, I understand the halachic allowance to take it, but is there an obligation to so do? Is this something that I'm expected to do? And the answer is, yes, it is something that we're expected to do. even for someone who is in a low risk category. Someone may say, look, I'm young and I'm an age where my immune system works well, and in general, this shouldn't pose a high level of risk to me. Even if someone decides that they don't belong to a high risk category, nonetheless, it seems clear in Halacha that one is expected to do so. There's a Ramah who says that in a time of plague, one should flee the city in order to avoid getting the plague. The modern equivalent of that is obviously obeying rules around isolation, but also contemporary equivalent of that would seem to be vaccination. And indeed, many of the contemporary poskim make this comparison. It's appropriate to protect ourselves in a time of pandemic, and this is the way we flee the city, by getting the vaccination. And Baruch Hashem, we live in a time where human wisdom has allowed us to create technologically other ways of protecting ourselves instead of just needing to flee and run away. In addition, we have an obligation to protect others. So again, even if we think we may be safe or immune, or we may be tempted to say, well, if everyone else gets it, and that will bring down the rates and I don't need to get it, we have an obligation to protect others. This is based upon the pasuk, don't stand idly by, don't stand over the blood of one's fellow, from which the Gemara in Sanhedrin teaches us, if one sees someone drowning in the river or an animal attacking them, one should leap to their defense, because the pasuk says, "Lo samud al dam re'acha," we shouldn't stand idly by. Interestingly, by the way, in the medieval era, in the era of the Rishonim, there was a sefer called Sefer Chasidim, and in it he speaks about this in the context of infection. He talks about someone who is infected, someone who has leprosy or infective boils or the like, and he says they should be careful not to bathe in the same river as other people, not to use the same water, because of the danger they will pose to others. We should love our fellow as ourselves. Not stand over the blood of others. Don't put a stumbling block in front of others. And therefore, causing or risking causing infection to others is clearly not the right way to behave. More than that, the Gemara in Baba Basra talks about social responsibilities, communal responsibilities, and this is paskened in the Shulchan Aruch. So, for example, the Gemara talks about a participating in the guarding of a city, or at least paying for the expenses of guarding a city. Now, this is known as the problem of the commons, that there's a temptation for each person to be a free rider. Let everyone else pay for the guarding of the city or do their share, and I will be able to benefit from it without cost to myself. In other words, there's many scenarios in which it's to my advantage to let everyone else take responsibility, and I'll be automatically included because it's not possible to exclude me from the benefit. And the Gemara in Baba Basra says that there's a social contract of sorts, there's an expectation on everyone to do their fair share of communal need. And therefore, this would apply similarly here. We have a possibility of erecting a wall around our city, not a physical wall to keep enemies out, but a medical wall to keep infection down. And therefore, this is part of the sort of social contract of mutual responsibility to each other to do so. So it appears to me that in Halacha, there is an expectation on someone to vaccinate themselves, certainly and obviously if they pose a danger to themselves, but equally if they pose a danger to others, even if this isn't protecting their own lives, this is protecting others. And even if one believes medically it's possible to let others do it and not do it oneself, nonetheless, there's an expectation of all of us taking our fair share. Now, there is an interesting question in medical ethics about autonomy in medical practice, and this is a sensitive matter. How do we deal with people who aren't behaving in a medically sensible manner? And this question is really twofold. The first aspect of this question is, can I force someone to take medical intervention when they're refusing to do so. This is a very troubling and difficult medical matter. And in the context of vaccination, this is particularly difficult. There was a stage, I'm not sure whether this is still going on, where China was forcing some of its citizens, for example, to take vaccination, or at least that was what was reported. Whether accurately or not, I don't know. Would it be ethical in Halacha to force someone to take a vaccination if they choose not to? If they are of the mistaken view that this is something dangerous, and they're afraid, even though there's no logic to that. And many senior poskim adopt the stance that forcing people to do something is not so simple. One should try and put maximum persuasion and try and calm people down and try and reassure people that this is the right thing to do. But there is a concept of autonomy in situations, unless someone is literally causing their own imminent ill health or demise. Whereas with something like immunization, where at the end of the day one is playing off risks, even though this person is making a halachically unacceptable option, we don't always force people to behave in a moral and halachic or even rational manner. We have to give people space for irrationality, and in the same way as we don't force people to keep halacha in other areas, similarly, one shouldn't necessarily force people in this situation. So this is the many poskim adopt the stance that we can't force people to take a vaccination, even though we should definitely encourage it. Having said that, the rest of society is entitled to say, fine, we're not going to force you to take this vaccination. Nonetheless, we want to protect ourselves. And there's a lot of discussion in the media about this. Can a shul, a school, an aeroplane company, employers, can they ban people who refuse to take a vaccination? There's discussion, I believe Israel is currently considering creating a vaccine passport. I believe the World Health Organization is looking into that possibility. So it would in Halacha appear to be wholly legitimate for society to take steps to protect itself against those who behave irrationally and refuse to take sensible medical steps, even though it may be that the right of autonomy is such that it wouldn't be appropriate for us to force people against their autonomy. There's a lot of discussion about the ethics of medical treatment of people who bring along medical problems on themselves. In triage, for example, there's a discussion about whether with limited medical resources, should one lesser the priority of those who are obese, or those who smoke, or those who take irresponsible risks. In Halacha, Ihud Ovid Anafshe, there's a concept of someone causing their own harm on themselves. And there are two stances, both in medical ethics and in Halacha, as to how to approach this. One approach would be, it's true that someone's own foolish behavior got themselves into the mess, but nonetheless, now that they are in this situation, we have an ethical and halachic responsibility to treat them. There are others who bring proof from a fascinating Gemara in Eruvin, Chavtes Omud Beis, in which the Gemara talks about someone who ignores medical advice, and the Gemara says we will nonetheless still daven for them because Shar Tzrichalo, this is someone who the generation needs, this is a very prominent public figure, and therefore we'll still daven for them, which seems to imply, and the Ritva there indeed makes this deduction, that were it to be the case that this person had behaved irresponsibly and brought the ill health on themselves, we wouldn't have a responsibility to daven for them. Very, very controversial ethical and halachic matter. If someone is goram ra la'atzmo, if they cause self-harm to themselves, what is our responsibility? I'm skeptical as to what degree any of this would apply in these cases, because in general, one would hope that the assumption is that someone who has been irresponsible in this area, it's because they've misunderstood and they've made mistakes, perhaps due to a lack of insight or education or understanding. And at least currently, the practice is not NHS practice, and in most medical ethics, it is not to penalize someone after the event, even though perhaps they've brought this difficulty upon themselves. So these are a number of halachic sources around the responsibility to vaccinate. It seems clear, as I said, that the consensus of poskim is that there is a responsibility to vaccinate, that as a society, it may be right for us to take steps to protect ourselves from infection if people don't vaccinate. But equally, autonomy would allow people to make choices even though we disapprove of those choices. This would appear to be the halachic summary. I should mention, by the way, that I deliberately chose to make this shiur non-textual and not to go at source sheets. I'm referencing throughout this a number of sources. For those who are interested afterwards, I'm happy to send a sources for those who want to look at greater detail in anything that I'm mentioning. So this is a discussion around the taking of vaccination and the responsibility to so do. There has been discussion in the poskim, moving on to the next related topic, about whether one should make a bracha of shechayanu or hatoiv v'hametiv, which I'll explain in a moment, upon receiving the vaccine. So broadly speaking, and actually I'm running through these halachas after the hashkama minyan in shul at the moment. I do a short piece of Rambam every Shabbos after the hashkama minyan. And we happen to be up to the halachas of shechayanu and hatoiv v'hametiv at the moment. Simon, Levi, I see you nodding. So we happen to be in the middle of those halachas. In the world of brachas, there are really three types of blessings. There's birchas hanenin, brachas made on food or other physical pleasures. So we eat an apple, we make a bracha. There's birchas hamitzvahs, we do a mitzvah, we make a bracha. And then there are birchas hashvach, brachas of praise to Hashem, which themselves include many subcategories. There's brachas of praise, like thunder and lightning. There's brachas of thanks, like a hagomel after someone's been through a prison or captivity or a life-threatening situation, and make a bracha of hagomel, or recovered from a serious illness. And then there's brachas of request to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like tefillah, in the middle of the Amidah. So there's many categories of brachas. Now, one amongst the brachas of praise to Hashem are twin brachas known as shechayanu and hatoiv v'hametiv. So we're familiar with shechayanu when we eat a new fruit, seasonal fruit, and we're excited, we've started a new season. We say a bracha of thanks to Hashem. Similarly, the bracha of hatoiv v'hametiv is made when one has a shared good news or good pleasure. So shechayanu is said if it's a Yom Tov or if it's a new season, but it's also said if one gets a piece of good news. If one's discovered one's won the lottery, one would say shechayanu. If it's some good news that has occurred to one together with other people, that jointly many have participated in this, perhaps one's won the lottery together with the rest of one's family, then one would say a bracha of hatoiv v'hametiv. Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, hatoiv, that Hashem is good, v'hametiv, and does good. So this is a type of joint shechayanu, a less familiar bracha than shechayanu, on a joint experience. Now, there are poskim who have voiced the view that someone who undergoes the vaccine should make the bracha of shechayanu because they have received the vaccine, which surely is a cause of great joy to them, or perhaps even hatoiv v'hametiv, the bracha said on a communal or shared piece of good news, because in them getting the vaccine, they are also helping others. And they base this on the halacha we've just discussed, which is really a mishnah in brachas, which says that if one gets good news, one says shechayanu or hatoiv v'hametiv, parallel to the sadly more familiar bracha. If one gets bad news, one would say baruch dayan ha'emes, in which we recognize Hashem as the true and faithful judge. And the argument to say the bracha on this is, and this is a psychologically true fact, that people, when they receive the vaccine, indeed experience a sense of great joy and relief, and surely we would want to praise Hashem for so doing. Nonetheless, I am of the opinion that it is not appropriate to say a bracha, and I want to explain why. I think there's numerous reasons why it is not correct to say the bracha of shechayanu or hatoiv v'hametiv. And the first one is that, in a sense, an appeal to precedent, which is that this isn't the first time in history there have been pandemics. This isn't the first time in history that people have been unwell and received medication. This is sadly a very extreme example of this, but there are ma'asim b'chol yom, there are regular affairs in which people have been ill and they receive medication and feel a great sense of relief and gratitude and appreciation that the technology is there to protect them and to save them. And indeed, if someone has been unwell and has recovered, we are aware of a separate bracha established to deal with that situation. And this is the bracha of Birchas HaGomel. HaGomel Achayom Tos. We thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for saving us from a situation of danger. So someone who has suffered ill health, extreme ill health, such as, God forbid, someone who's actually been through COVID and really been unwell with it, would make the bracha of HaGomel as appreciation for the recovery. But nowhere do we find that recovery from illness also says Shechionu. There's a separate bracha for it. And therefore it seems to me that evidently this is not included in the category simply from the absence of evidence, in this case being evidence of absence. We don't find anywhere throughout halachic literature or history that on receiving a cure from illness or protection from illness, that this is the appropriate bracha to make. What would be the logic? Why would one not make a bracha on this? So there's a number of reasons for this. A number of reasons why this wouldn't be included in the normal halachic category, including the fact that this is removing a problem rather than gaining something positive in itself. And whilst we are grateful that a problem has gone away, nonetheless, we recognize that ultimately this is a removal of something that's very painful and difficult and tragic, rather than it being good in its own right. There's halachic discussion around this, but just to give a very crude example, if someone has been in a marriage and they now want to end the marriage, and they receive a get out from the marriage, so they may feel a great sense of release and relief, but nonetheless, one doesn't say a bracha of Shechionu on this because this is removal of a problem. Similarly, someone who's released from jail, from prison, let's say they've been wrongfully imprisoned, and they've been in danger, they make the bracha of HaGomel, they don't make the bracha of Shechionu. So this wouldn't appear to be the appropriate bracha to make. Indeed, we find that on many happy occasions, we don't say the bracha of Shechionu, only when something specific happens, when something specifically is received. For example, we don't say a bracha of Shechionu when one marries, or when one marries off a child. We don't make a bracha of Shechionu at a bris, which is a periodic mitzvah due to the pain suffered by the child. And here in the vaccine itself, we're aware that this is in the context of pain. The vaccine itself is positive, obviously, in the long term, but has some short-term pain associated with it. So I don't believe that the normative halachic approach would be to say Shechionu. Besides the debate over whether in this situation, were one to make it, this should be viewed as a collective or individual benefit, and therefore whether Hatov V'Ametiv or Shechionu is appropriate. If one nonetheless feels moved and inspired to thank Hashem, there are two perfectly viable halachic solutions. One is with Tu B'Shvat coming to eat a new fruit and say Shechionu on that, and thus avoid the halachic doubt, or indeed wear a new item of clothing. But actually, I would recommend going back to the Shulchan Aruch and to the classic sources, because they do mention a very beautiful bracha that one should say when one is about to undergo a medical procedure. And this is a Shulchan Aruch based in a Gemara, in which it says there's a bracha, Yirotzon L'fanecha, Hashem Elokai, She'esek Zeh Lilu Refuah, Ki Rofech Inomata. Thank you, Hashem, it should be your will that this medical procedure I'm receiving should succeed in being as a healing act for me, because you are the gracious giver of healing. And when the procedure is finished, the Shulchan Aruch says, one says, Baruch Reifecholim. So there is a text of a tefillah, of an expression of appreciation and thanks for medicine that saves us. And therefore it's appropriate that someone who feels moved to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu should do so, but not through making a bracha. Bracha is a very strict criteria when they are said. We're aware of the concept of a bracha, the vatala, of a bracha that shouldn't be said, inappropriately said. It's misusing the name of Hashem, but there are plenty of other ways to express thanks and appreciation. Mizmor Soda. Mizmor Soda is the tehillah that we say every day in Shachris, in which traditionally was said when a carbon toda, a thanksgiving offering was brought. And again, one can certainly say Mizmor Soda, the 100th tehillah in the book of Psalms. One can say Nishmas Kol Chai. And there's also a very beautiful updated text of the tefillah that should be said when one is undergoing a medical procedure, which Rav Rimon, who is the Rav in Gush, adapted. He is also incidentally of the belief that, where he questions the possibility of saying Shachionu and Tatova Meitiv, and he suggests an updated version of this Yiratzon, which I'll post in the chat group so that anyone who wants to have it can see the text that he proposes. And I'm happy to share it with people afterwards, in which he suggests a beautiful text of thanks to Hashem for receiving the vaccination. But certainly my view and the view of many other poskim is that it is not appropriate to say a bracha on this. It doesn't fulfill the criteria of Shachianu, though no doubt one feels a great deal of thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There have been a couple of questions over here in the chat group, which I'll address before I move on to further halachic points. Someone wrote here, a question many people in the age group have is the risk for fertility and on an unborn child. Now, I'm not a doctor, and therefore it's inappropriate for me to give a medical answer. This is something that has to be addressed to the doctors. However, I have spoken to many doctors, tens of doctors around this subject. And again, the very clear medical consensus is that there is no reason to assume, no basis of evidence, no research that shows that there is a risk to people if to people in terms of fertility. Whereas getting COVID, and even when we just look at the statistics of mortality, but just looking at long COVID and possible long-term risks to health, there's considerably higher risk. And therefore, I would really urge everyone, if you are worried about this, speak to your doctor if you have concerns. I can't, and it's not appropriate for me to give out medical advice, but I can say very categorically and clearly the message I've heard from many doctors that there is not a risk in terms of fertility. Someone else has texted me about risk for people with underlying medical conditions. Again, this is certainly not for me as a Rav to comment on. Speak to the doctors, and if you have an underlying medical condition, then check with your doctor. Someone else wrote to me about autonomy may be fine, but can a shul or school exclude someone who chooses not to vaccinate? So I guess that was sent before I got up to addressing that, in which I said that there will need to be discussions around this. And there have been discussions around other vaccinations also. I personally am of the view that it would be wrong for society to impose against people's autonomy certain decisions. However, it is appropriate for schools to take steps to protect themselves if people are posing risks to other students. So obviously this will need to be looked at on a closer case-by-case basis. But in principle, yes, I do think it's appropriate for people to take steps to protect themselves. Someone else asked about Hilchos Shabbos. If one gets an appointment, I will get up to that shortly. That I will cover that in the time available. Okay, moving on to again, someone has written to me about allergies. Again, any specific medical questions I can't comment on. You have to ask your doctor themselves. If one of the doctors in the group know about allergies, I'll be very grateful if you post to me that so I can share it with everyone. But again, one has to ask the doctors about specific conditions. I can say that, again, the very clear consensus, and this certainly in Halacha is correct, is that one should, the risks are negligible in someone with no underlying health conditions. What about triage with the vaccine? So this is a more general question, perhaps a less practical halachic question, though there may be people here in the audience who have a role in setting public policy around these issues. But what criteria should the government use to decide who to vaccinate first and who to vaccinate in the case of limited supply of vaccines or limited availability of doctors and medical staff, because it simply takes time to vaccinate everyone? There's been a lot of discussion in the media about the age rollout, about vaccinating medical staff first. I'm a teacher, about vaccinating teachers first. A lot of discussion in the media about one vaccine or two vaccines. Should we try and create a greater rollout of a single vaccine first to provide lower level of cover rather than more limited people getting a higher level of cover? All very interesting questions. Now, the first and simplest thing to say on all of that is that the parameter of halacha is to maximize the saving of life. No doubt whatsoever. In brief, if option A will save 1 million people, and option B will save 500,000 people, no doubt whatsoever we are meant to go for the option that will save more lives. And therefore it's perfectly appropriate for government to use an algorithm to determine which option will save more lives, whether it's giving a limited number of people 2 vaccines or more people 1 vaccine. I can't comment on algorithms, I can't comment on the medical debate about the facts of the effectiveness of 1 or 2 vaccines. All this is obviously beyond my range, but I'm going to say in principle the government is using the correct halachic criteria. But now we get to the more contentious issue, and this is still a matter of debate in the UK, about vaccinating other people who are considered to have greater value for society. So doctors, medics, transport workers, educators, all of these factors that are allowed to be taken into account. Now, I saw some poskim who wrote that this is not appropriate in halacha. Society values shouldn't be used to determine who gets vaccinated first. And they quote the classic principles of triage. Now, the classic principles of triage are if you have someone who is definitely in danger and someone who is possible danger, prioritize the person with definite danger. This is a prima godin. If you have someone who is more likely to respond to treatment or less likely to respond to treatment, prioritize the person who is more likely to respond to treatment. This is a psak of Shlomo Zalman. If one has someone who has another underlying medical condition that will mean that they anyway have a limited lifespan against someone who is healthy, then prioritize the person who is likely to live longer, and so on and so forth. General rules of triage. In general, however, we don't weigh up the value of the life of the person. So we would never go down the route of saying this person is more valuable than this person, and therefore they should be treated first. We even won't use things like expected life expectancy as long as there isn't a particular underlying medical condition that will anyway kill the person. There was a lot of discussion about in the media recently about someone who said that someone with a shorter life expectancy has less value to their life than someone with a longer life expectancy. In general, in halacha, we would consider life to have infinite value, and therefore we wouldn't make these sorts of equations. However, I don't believe that this is all that is to be said on the subject, and therefore I don't believe that triage cannot take into account societal utility, though I recognize that this opens a can of worms. And the basis of this is a very difficult and troubling Mishnah in Horios, which talks about triage based upon utility to society. I'll give the reference to the Mishnah to those who are interested in looking it up. It's a very, very difficult Mishnah to understand. Most of the Mishnah is actually not brought to the Halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, though the Ramah does make a reference to it. And again, I'm willing to share sources afterwards. The Vilna Gaon and perhaps the Rambam understand this to be a Mishnah that is a source that someone who has a clear societal utility over someone else, maybe this is a basis of priority. Now, the contemporary poskim, Moshe Feinstein, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman, all emphasize that obviously this needs to be weighed up with care. This is a very incendiary and potentially dangerous rule of triage. And they all say that in the setting of emergency treatment, it's absolutely not possible to apply this triage principle. They have to have in triage the principle that we are not going to base a decision on the societal utility of someone. However, they recognize that if we are in the situation of public policy, where there is time to reflect, argue, debate, and consider societally through the institutions of debate this area, it is possible that it is appropriate to make a decision around utility. And this is, for example, the decisions that government makes to protect world leaders, the prime minister or a president. In a time of war, we understand that Churchill had a special bunker, and this is considered non-controversial because we understand there are certain people who are so necessary for society that undisputedly so, that it is appropriate to use this as a rule of triage. So I do believe it is appropriate for society to engage in reflection and consider whether there are certain key workers, educators, fire people, and so on, who could be prioritized, and that's not an inappropriate halachic decision to make, even though we are therefore using a different equation to that of maximizing number of people who survive. In other words, we're not just going to look at the risks, but we're also going to look at the societal benefit. Medics obviously qualify under both counts. They are clearly societally necessary, number one. Number two, saving them means that they are able to save more people and therefore maximize the saving life. And number three, they are at greater risk. So in terms of medics, one ticks all the three boxes. In terms of other figures like firefighters and educators, perhaps some of the boxes. And in terms of politicians and whether they should be prioritized, I leave that to everyone's judgment. So these are our rules of triage, and I think it's appropriate in triage to be aware that even though generally we prioritize maximizing life, there are some exceptions that might be able to major that. What about pushing to the front of the queue? Is it appropriate if I have, I saw a newspaper article a while back about a hospital had perhaps foolishly given its staff, maybe all hospitals do this, and there was only one case where it leaked, they've given their staff a login code to log in to book a vaccine early, and someone or other leaked this login code, and it spread around various WhatsApp groups, and people who weren't medics at all were using the medical WhatsApp code, login code to push themselves in front of the queue. So in a case where one is pushing oneself in front of the queue and therefore effectively depriving others of it, I think it is clear that this is osser. It's a question of gezel, of theft, because the government is allocating it to people in basis of the criteria that the government decides, and therefore it's inappropriate to push in front. It's din and malchusa. It would involve sheker and lying if one's illicitly claiming a status that one doesn't have. Obviously, there's potential for us to do this as chilul Hashem, and possibly one is being goyim, causing the death of someone else who is more needy. These shilas were discussed by the poskim in terrible circumstances during the Holocaust. There's a psak that was center of Meislish in the Meisels in Auschwitz about bribing a guard to remove someone from a transport, a selection, where it was understood that very quickly the number count would reveal that one person was missing and someone else would be substituted, effectively pushing oneself ahead of the queue to save one's own life, where it's inevitable that this will affect someone else who will then be pushed further back in the queue, and it is absolutely clear that this is osser. However, if it won't deprive anyone, for example, surplus stock at the end of the day, or where because of the way the number count is done, or because of the refrigeration requirements, you have stock that's going to be unable to be used the next day. This is legitimate if this is done in a systematic manner, and I believe one of the reasons Israel has succeeded in rolling out the vaccine fast is because they have more, they quickly acted on that and began allowing people at the end of the day when there was spare stock to be used. And I believe, though again the experts in the group can tell me if this is correct or not, I believe that this has started happening in the UK also, that when there are surplus stocks available, these are opened to anyone who's able to take advantage of that. So in a case where it's genuinely surplus stock and it's not going to affect anyone else, then yes, certainly it's okay. However, in a case of where it's pushing someone else further down the queue, this wouldn't be okay. Let's just use the time available perhaps to discuss a couple more questions, and then I'll just try and wrap this up. Let me just check the chat group because there's been a number of questions there. Okay, some of these questions are about personal medical conditions. Again, please ask doctors. And then someone wrote, the question of vaccinating NHS personnel is not because they're more valuable, but the fact that they need to treat those unwell. Absolutely. And they're at greater risk. So you have all three factors there: more valuable, greater risk, and necessary for everyone else's medical situation. Okay, what happens if one gets an appointment on Shabbos? Is one allowed to go into an appointment on Shabbos? And the answer is yes, absolutely so. Going into an appointment does not involve any chilul Shabbos. For now, I'm going to assume one can walk to the appointment. Doctors will know that giving injections isn't actually really chilul Shabbos. Taking blood involves potential chilul Shabbos. An injection doesn't involve chilul Shabbos. An injection well given actually doesn't draw blood at all. And if it does draw blood, it's an unintended side consequence. It's not chilul Shabbos to give an injection. The medical staff giving the injection do need to write down various records and notations and so on, but that's not me causing them to do that. I'm simply going in to receive vaccination for the purpose of record keeping. The vaccine needs to be noted and things need to be written down. It's not amir la'akum. I haven't told anyone to do it. It's absolutely appropriate to go in and receive a vaccination. What happens if some chilul Shabbos will be involved? For example, one needs to take a taxi to go in because one's clinic is far from one's home, or one is unable to walk due to elderly or disabilities or whatever it may be. The answer is basically in such a case also one should do so, but I am not going to give a general besuck because these things need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis and one needs a proper discussion about how to do it. But I absolutely would encourage someone, if you have been given an appointment on Shabbos, don't turn it down. If you can walk there, no shiur needs to be asked, go there and get the vaccination. If you need to be given a drive there, then please call me and one can work it out. This is assuming, obviously, I should mention when I talk about driving there, assuming that it can't easily and swiftly be rearranged for the next day. In general, the case is that it complicates things. It's not possible to rearrange it. But as I said, if it does involve driving there, ask a shiur. If it doesn't involve driving there, no shiur to be asked. In terms of doctors going in and giving vaccinations themselves and the potential chilul Shabbos involved in that because they will need to write, again, I don't think this forum is appropriate to give a general psak, but please speak to me if this question is relevant to you. I'm running out of time, so perhaps I'll just conclude with 3 practical reflections in the last 2 minutes available to me. The first one is a point of hashkafa, which is really just the wonders of the human immune system, and particularly the idea that a little bit of the illness itself successfully modified and tweaked to make it harmless as per classic immunizations. Current immunizations don't even necessarily involve that. But the idea that the body is equipped within itself to fight infection and has the resources itself, if we are able to trigger it, is really a wonderful idea. The reflection and idea that nothing is all bad or all good, and that often, as we say, refuah codes and mamaka, that within the illness is the potential for the healing itself, is something very powerful. And for me, I find that somewhat comforting as we think about the difficult times we are going through. These are difficult. We're all under an enormous amount of stress, and it is certainly a time that's been very, very challenging. But to realize that in bad, there is a good that can be drawn out always is something very, very powerful. In a sense, this is the essence of life. Delayed gratification, realizing that taking a little bit of pain can sometimes bring out something good inherent in it, is something that is at the heart really of our ability as humans to succeed and to cope. And that's one reflection just around the idea of vaccinations. The second is appreciation of the world we live in, the wisdom that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has granted to human beings, that we live in a society that cares about health, that provides the opportunities for human insight to help us, and then we live in a moral society, a society that has made a decision to suffer the largest economic catastrophe really in centuries in order to preserve life. And we need to know, again, I think decades will pass till we're able to make proper assessment about how well the government did, whether every decision was right or wrong. But the broader premise of a society that says we are going to go into a lockdown to protect life, in particular to protect the life of those who are older and vulnerable, is a fantastic thing. And therefore, this is certainly a time where we should be thanking Shanasam Chachmaso Nevasav Adam. And finally, to conclude with the Shulchan Aruch's tefillah that I mentioned before, thank Hashem. We should thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch is the gracious healer. We should certainly thank Hashem as we receive medication, as we receive help. And I guess the final word is, if you're offered the vaccine, get it. There should be absolutely no doubt to any of us, halachically, morally, medically, in terms of common sense, if you're offered the vaccine, get it, take advantage of it as soon as possible for the sake of our health, for the sake of your health, for the sake of every individual's health, and for the sake of society's ability to get back to normal. That's clearly the correct and right thing to do. So I will stop there because I've used my allocated time. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to stay on, obviously, and take these. But thank you so much, as always, to everyone for joining. I really appreciate it. Really good to see you all. Okay, thank you for that question. I did not mention Dinah de Malchus or Dinah in this shiur, because at the moment now there is no government legal requirement to get a vaccine, and therefore, to my mind, the concept of Dinah de Malchus, or the law of the land, wouldn't apply. Were the government to make it a requirement, then I think Dinah de Malchus would apply, as I discussed when I spoke about Dinah de Malchus near the beginning of lockdown, to listen to government's health requirements. Unless one was of the opinion that this was dangerous to so do, in which case Dinah de Malchus wouldn't force someone to do something dangerous. So for someone who is of the misguided opinion that this is dangerous, or for someone for whom it genuinely is dangerous because of some underlying health condition, I don't think the law of the land can make someone do something dangerous. For someone for whom it is not dangerous, it's anyway appropriate and I'll be mandated to do so, even without Dinah de Malchus or Dinah, but Dinah de Malchus would add another layer where it's applied. At the moment, though, that's theoretical because, as I said, the government is not currently requiring people to, it's not a legal obligation to get a vaccine.